Hello, everybody. Welcome to Subtle Asian Book Club. We are a book club dedicated to amplifying Asian authors and Asian storytellers. I'm Alexandra, also known as Twirling Pages, and I'm one of the co-hosts. I'm here with Tiffany, also known as Read by Tiffany, who is my other co-host. And we're super excited to talk with the author of Other Words from Home, which was the book of the month for our March book of the month. So, Jasmine, can you please introduce yourself and your many books? And as a quick icebreaker afterwards, what was your favorite book so far this year?
Yeah, all great questions. So I'm Jasmine Warga. I've written several different books, mostly for middle graders, including the book we're going to talk about today, Other Words for Home. But I also have two other middle grade novels, The Shape of Thunder, and then my newest middle grade book, A Rover's Story. And we are sort of early into the year now, but I'd say my favorite book that I have read this year is Dan Santat's graphic novel memoir called A First Time for Everything, which is about looking back on this trip that he took to Europe at the end of 8th grade, and just sort of that awkwardness of being in junior high, but also being brave enough to kind of find yourself and let people see you. And it really took me back to being a teenager, and also was just so fun. He's an amazing artist, but it's also really just awesome storytelling. So highly recommend.
We love a good coming of age story.
Yes, I'm definitely adding that to my list. I'm so excited to read it, especially since I've been trying to read more graphic novels as well.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. It's funny because I'm not usually a graphic novel reader, which I know like they're very popular, and I get why. And especially being a middle grade author, like the number one question I get asked at school visits is like, are you going to write a graphic novel? Do you write graphic novels? So I know like how ubiquitous they are, but I think because I didn't grow up with them, it's taken me a little bit of time to almost understand how to read them, how to really like be patient and look at the pictures and let it be that like full immersive reading experience. But I found this one just so charming, and it really, like I said, captured that like true feeling of feeling like so embarrassed about yourself and the world and how insecure you can feel at that age, but also it's just like so heartwarming to watch the character, which is actually Dan, sort of change and come in to gain some confidence.
Loki feels so relatable right now.
Seriously, even as grown adults, I can relate.
Okay, so we're very excited to be interviewing you today. So I'm going to jump right into the questions. So the first one that we have is that it's been a few years since Other Words for Home was published. How has your book, your relationship with this book evolved since it was first published back in 2019? And how has this book shaped the way you approach writing your other novels, such as The Shape of Thunder and A Rover's Story, and even maybe your future works?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. I think that when I was writing Other Words for Home, I never could have anticipated that the book would find the audience that it's found or get the reception that it had gotten. I actually, while I was writing the book, had so much self-doubt about it. I worried that it was way too niche of a story, right? That it was too Arab or too Muslim to find an audience, like so many creators who I'm sure you've interviewed on the show who have this story. When I was growing up, I never saw myself in a book. I never saw someone from my background in a book. And I think I learned to erase myself in writing. And it's not until I learned that like writing really isn't about hiding. I think that for a long time I used writing as like a way to escape for myself and try to pretend to be somebody else or try to fit in. And really, Other Words for Home was a watershed moment of me of learning that writing's really actually about showing yourself and sharing yourself. And so but while doing that, I was really scared, right? And I was also really scared that no one was going to care about the book, that the book wasn't going to find any readers. And so now, almost 4 years out from the original publication date, I think my relationship with the book has changed, that I've learned to be braver in that way, that like things that I had somehow internalized were niche don't have to be, right? I've seen kids from like really rural Ohio connect with the book in the same way that I've seen kids in New York City connect with the book, and like understanding that good storytelling is good storytelling, right? And not worrying so much about who the readers are going to be, but worrying about trying to tell the best possible story that I can. I think that I also want to tell lots of different stories. So sometimes it can be hard because I'll think, oh, is this going to disappoint, readers of Other Words for Home because it's so different from it? Maybe it's not in verse or it's a different style. But again, I think returning to what the book really taught me, which was to tell the story that I feel compelled to tell and trust that the book will find its audience.
I love that so much. I loved Other Words for Home so much, and it was my first book that I read that you've written. So I'm super excited to read all of your other books. And I'm sure even as it changes, like the way you tell the story and like the impact and all the emotions that you put into it, it will speak for itself. So yeah. We were really moved and inspired by your author's note, which you mentioned the inspiration for Other Words for Home, saying that the idea was from a close family friend's dinner and their experience of escaping the violence in Syria. From those initial conversations, how did the story evolve over time? And along with that, were there any other stories or events that particularly stood out to you when you were writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, my own family is Palestinian Jordanian, but growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, our closest friends were Syrian American. And so at this particular like family dinner that I went over to, I was introduced to members of the family I never met before because as you say in the author's note, they had just recently come over from Syria because of the growing conflict there. And at this point, the conflict hadn't reached the point that it would reach, and it definitely wasn't yet being covered in Western media. So I actually didn't know a lot about what was going on in Syria until this dinner. And what sort of struck me though was the relationship I was watching between the cousins who like the members of the family I'd grown up with, right? Who are like me, who are born here in America, who English is their first language, and their cousins from the Middle East. And I was thinking about, how complicated my relationship was with my identity when I was younger. Particularly, I was in 8th grade when 9/11 happened. And I think that I internalized a lot of like self-hatred. And I had this idea that I sort of had to pick between these parts of myself, right? I had this false idea that somehow my Muslim identity was in conflict with my American identity. And so I started thinking about like, what would it have been like for me when I was younger if my cousins from the Middle East had come to live with us? Like, what would that have been like? And so initially, I actually thought I was going to write the book from the American cousins' perspective. Because I was watching this dynamic between the cousins. I was thinking about my own relationship with my cousins who live in Jordan, right? And how when I was a kid, like I would get so excited to go spend the summers in Jordan, but also that I never quite felt like I fit in, right? That I was always like searching for this way to feel like I really belong there and wasn't like the American. Like I think I never felt more American than when I would go to Jordan in the summer, yet so much of my childhood experience was not feeling American enough in my small Ohio town. And so I think that dynamic to me was so on display when I was watching the cousins interact. And so that's what initially got me thinking. And then later on, when I decided I really wanted to write from the perspective of someone who has to leave their home because of war and because of conflict, I started by interviewing the members of the family who would come over. And I was really struck by this idea of how many people, and I see this in my own family, hold this really idolized view of what America is, right? And this like dream of America. And I think that was something I really wanted to capture in the book, is this idea of sort of the myth of America versus the reality of America, but also like reclaiming some of that joy around America. Because I feel like in our recent sort of political atmosphere, somehow like it's gotten lost that I feel like so many immigrants, then they have this really, really big dream and love for America. And like, how do you convey that? Because that's what I found in all of the interviews, that I found that even when they would talk about how difficult and how hard things were, they felt so much gratitude to be here. And I think that that's something that I wanted to tease out, but in hopefully like a nuanced way of looking at, you know, the main character in the book. She has this glossy idea of America, right? The only thing she knows about America are from like American movies where everyone lives in big mansions in Beverly Hills. And that's how my cousin was when I was growing up. I mean, I feel like the world of media has flattened more now because like on Netflix, we can all stream the same movie at the same time. But when I was growing up, my cousins were watching like American movies from like 5 or 10 years like back. And I was also fascinated that they had no idea what Ohio was really, right? When they thought of America, they thought of New York City and they thought of Los Angeles. So I was thinking about what that would be like for like Jude's character when she comes over, and was getting that sense from the people that I interviewed too about just like how when they had dreamed of America, they weren't dreaming of Cincinnati, Ohio, right? But for better and for worse, like what they came to find there, and how sometimes like the dream is not what you expected, but it's also beautiful in this different way.
Wow, that was so beautifully said. I don't even know where to start because you made so many like beautiful, touching points. But yeah, I'm just so grateful that we have this book to read, because I think we learn so much about events, but at the same time, I think at the heart of it, it's really about empathy and learning so much about Jude's character and the hope that she has. So I don't know. I think that's what I really love most about the book. So hearing you explain just how it came to be is really inspiring. And just, I'm like, oh my God, I want to know more. I kind of wish I were there with you at these interviews because it's just so fascinating and also so touching. And even the parts you talk about, like the dual identities, obviously something many people in the book club have related to, and we always consistently talk about. So it just makes so much sense, and it feels really good to just have that continuously validated. So we wanted to talk a little bit about your research process as you were writing this book, and you were saying you were doing some of these interviews. Was there anything else, like when it comes to news articles or news events, and when it came to these like news or interviews, what part was the most difficult and what part was the most rewarding? And maybe if there were like a specific conversation that really struck out to you?
Yeah, I think that what was most difficult is that I've never been to the country of Syria, right? And I've also never had the lived experience of being an immigrant, let alone a refugee, right? And so while I felt like I was writing in a sense about from the perspective of a character who shares many identity markers with me, it was still very different from my own life experience. And so I had to rely on the generosity of other people to share their story with me. And I think what I remember so much was, I think there's obvious questions you would ask, right, about the feeling of leaving home, all of those ideas. But I think that so much of writing is empathetic imagination. And so those were the, sorry, I have like tattoos on my, like fake tattoos on my hands that my kids gave me. And I'm realizing that maybe looks odd on the camera. But back to what I was saying of, you know, what I really wanted more was the details of like what their home life was really like, right? Because I think for the book to work, you have to understand what people have given up and what about home that they miss the most beyond that core of, I think all of us can instantly understand you would miss your family and those things. But, you know, is it a smell in the morning? What was the street like that you always walked down? What was your routine like? How did that change? And so just asking people, trying to get as much detail as I could to make it feel really real and not like that paint by numbers version of where like I would immediately go, right? To a place that, because since I had never been to Syria before, all I could rely on if I didn't have these interviews would be the news coverage, right? And then kind of that one narrative that you might hear. And so what I wanted to do was complicate that. And that's part of the reason why I set the book. It's unnamed in the book, but it's based on the same small seaside town where my family friends are originally from, because I also wanted to show like a different part of Syria that wasn't covered so much in the news, but that people were still really affected by it, and be able to talk so much. What I love to do at school visits is talk to kids, because I think a lot of times with the Middle East, we have this false sense of it being a region that's always at conflict. So we don't understand for kids like Jude how much they lost, right? How normal their life was, the fabric of their life was, how much I feel like an American kid would recognize in the pattern of her life. And that's what I really wanted to do. But I didn't want to do it with this like American lens, right? So I didn't want to just write about her going to school. I wanted to ask, what was that like? What did you do after school? What was the rhythm of your family? What do you do now in America? What do you find the most confusing about America? What do you find the most confusing about English? Like having those conversations. I know, especially for Arabic speakers, the word too is confusing. Like TOO is obviously, they mix it up substituting for so they'll be like, I love it too much. Just like simple things like that that I wouldn't necessarily think of because I grew up with English, right? So it's not, I think that when you're writing from the perspective of someone who doesn't speak the language, though, that offers up the opportunity to like sort of rediscover the quirks of English and why do we say things the way we say them, and what does that mean about the things that we value in the culture. I'm always interested in language in that way, and so I really, that's what a lot of the interviews centered around, because I feel like some of those immediate things that you might think to first ask aren't really the things that are going to give the book like texture and a feeling of authenticity. It's more, how can I really tell a specific story? And I think too, narrowing the lens. So I knew I would write about someone from Syria, from this particular part of Syria, who already had family in America, which is a very different refugee story, right? Than, those sort of horrifying news articles we would read about kids getting in really overcrowded boats and things like that. And I knew I couldn't write that story because I didn't have access to interview someone who had that lived experience. And so the way I would write that story would be from a very kind of cinematic place of imagination, which I think isn't going to feel as real as something where I had the privilege to get to interview people who had lived Jude's journey. And so I feel like authenticity is made through like specificity and almost making it as like her life in Syria, not mundane isn't the right word, but how I could really try to make it feel really, really real and lived in.
There is so much there that I love.
I know.
Again, I don't know where to start. Like, you talked about language, you talked about like a little bit about like writing style and like all this like other stuff. And I'm just like, these are all things that we will be diving into a little bit more later. So I'm excited to talk about it. You said something and then I wanted to say something as a response, but then I forgot. But
wait, can I jump in?
It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me.
Wait, can I jump in? As you were saying that, I was like, I think the thing we love the most, or at least I love the most about the book, is just, as you were saying, like how honest it is to those lived experience. Because I think one of my favorite scenes was when you were talking about like her in ESL classes and the friendships she makes in those. And then also specifically when she's talking about her brother, and she's like, oh, her brother was just such like a lively, wonderful character. He would jump on tables and like sing Whitney Houston. And that feels so like real. Like you can imagine the person, you're like, I can be friends with this person. So when you hear about whatever their family's going through and the heartache they're going through, it just magnifies like tenfold.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's like what's important, right? Is to create characters who feel real. And so they feel like the heart of the story, not their circumstances. I think that's what can be like the hiccup when you do write about something that you haven't lived yet. If you haven't lived it yourself, is that your immediate impulse is to make what the character's struggle is the star, as opposed to the character themselves the star. And I think that the people that I interviewed helped so much for me to keep them at the forefront of how I was going to create these characters and hopefully make it a story about their real lives. And this was a thing that had happened to them, but they also are happening, right? And have agency. And I think that's an important thing in all books, right? That we're always, as an author, are always trying to figure out how can we make our characters like feel real. And it is those specific types of details.
Yeah, for sure. I remember what I forgot earlier. But like when I was reading the book, it felt like so like fresh off the page and I could just like envision it. And so when you said that like you have never been to Syria before before, and like when you were writing this book, I was really surprised because like even though like most of the book is set in America, even like the parts that are in Syria and like just everything about it just felt so real, and so I was like so surprised. But it was so wonderfully and beautifully done. So it was amazing. I really loved it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And credit so much to the people who shared all of those amazing details about their old neighborhood with me too. So
Yes, we love that. So like I love reading middle grade novels, and this is a wonderful example of it. But then a lot of times I feel like the commentary is that like people are hesitant to share hard topics for middle grade readers. But Other Words for Home touches on topics of like Islamophobia, racism, and the refugee experience, which can be often labeled as like a hard, tough topic that may not be appropriate for young readers. But you did a really wonderful job. And why did you believe that it was important to touch on these topics, especially when the audience is relatively young?
no, I 100% really believe in books as sort of a safe space to have difficult conversations, right? And I think that even starts with younger readers. And why I love writing for middle grade audience so much is I feel like they sit at that perfect intersection between like imagination and introspection, that they're realizing things about the world and they're ready to have those types of conversations. But they're also such enthusiastic readers with lots of joy and lots of imagination. And so I think it's about creating a space where the book can open up space for them to have conversations about these things, but doing it in sort of a gentle way that leads them to that. But I think it's so important. I mean, these are things that they're experiencing, right? They're experiencing in their community and are happening. And I think that hiding that from them in a book doesn't hide it from them. It just robs them of the opportunity to have that discussion and have that thought and maybe feel seen or recognized in a book. The example like I always give about why I try to write books that sort of meet readers where I think that they are is that I will never forget when I was in fourth grade reading The Bridge to Terabithia. And my grandmother had just died. And I feel like that book meant the world to me because I felt like it was really honest with me, right? It was really honest with me about death and about this really difficult part of life. And it didn't sugarcoat it, but it also gave me hope because it didn't sugarcoat it. It made me believe other people have gone through this, other people have lived through this. This is something that happens. And you're going to be okay. And so I think that I really think actually that like books about quote unquote challenging topics are actually empowering for young readers because they let them know like they aren't alone. And then for other readers that maybe haven't gone through those things to almost have the experience, like I think in some ways reading is a place to test out having difficult, hard feelings before it may happen for you too, right? Like I remember reading about things in books before I went through them. And then when I would go through that in life, I would return to that book and what I learned from that character's journey. And so I think that's important for middle schoolers too. I think the key though is to have that hope piece, right? Actually, Catherine Patterson, who wrote Bridge to Terabithia, has a really famous like article that she wrote for the New York Times once about how like hope is the X factor of writing for young people. And that's what makes a book like a middle grade book, basically. And I believe that too, that I think that it's that really delicate balance of honesty and hope. I would never want to lie to my readers. I'll talk about things that are really difficult in the world, but what I really hope is by the time they finish the book, they feel empowered that the world can be a beautiful place because they can make the world a beautiful place, right? And so you don't want them to feel flattened by the book. You want them to feel uplifted, even if there's that. There's the discussion of those more difficult things because we all live with those things, right?
I wish I could have read this book when I was in middle grade because this would have been such like, I don't know, like such a not heartwarming, but like basically heartwarming, but just like such a good book to read is what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, and I'm really curious to know like how people like when you go do those middle school visits or school visits, what the reaction is like from all the kids.
Yeah, it's been incredible, right? I think some of the most moving experiences I've had have been from other Muslim kids who have come up to me and said, "This is the first time I ever saw myself in a book. I love this book so much. I saw my sister in this book, or I see my mother in this book, or I relate to this, or this is like my family story." And then other kids who come from immigrant backgrounds, other like ELL kids who connect with the book. That's been so affirming and wonderful to have those moments. That's also been really amazing to go into communities and schools where there really aren't any Muslim kids and read the letters from the kids who are like, I used to like be afraid of hijabs, or I didn't understand, or this has really changed the way I see the world, or this has made me want to be a kinder person. And those are so beautiful too, right? That like a kid who has really ostensibly no identity markers in common with Jude, but that universal quality of being 12, right? And I think that's what's so amazing about books is I think it's important that we have books that exalt different cultural identities for people of that group to see themselves in, and also for other people to get to, learn that those types of stories matter, but also the bridges that we all have, right? That I think a lot of kids can relate to this feeling of wanting to feel seen, of wanting to be the star in the school play, or wanting to fit in, or sort of that universal feeling of being in junior high. And so that's been really amazing to see, because if you had told me when I was in 7th grade that all these other 7th graders would connect with someone like Jude, that would have been very like different and like mind-boggling for me to believe that.
Awesome. Your
Wi-Fi cut out for a second, and I was like, but I'm back. Sorry to interrupt you in the middle of the sentence.
No, you're okay. I was worried. I was like, I hope that I didn't say something wrong. And
No. I was like so engrossed, and then it just like disappeared, and I was like, no. But I'm sorry to interrupt on your
oh no,
in the middle of your thought.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I was done, and I was just talking about kind of that duality of it's so affirming to meet the kids who like identity wise share a background with you. I mean, I got really emotional. I was just recently doing a school visit in the Pittsburgh area, and actually one of the teachers stood up and was talking about how she is Arab and Muslim and never saw herself in books. And when she found this book and was able to give it to her kids, and she made me cry there, you know what I mean? And so those have been amazing moments. And then, like I said, also the kids who like they don't know anything about the Middle East except for what they see on the news. And like I said, if the news only ever shows war and conflict, you sort of draw conclusions, right, about the people that live there. And so to be able to see those kids have this different lens, or to also start to think like, wow, I related to this story about someone like Jude. We have this and this in common. And I think it starts to open up a worldview. I mean, that's the great thing about like writing for young people is I think like the books we read when we're young really like influence the type of people that we grow up to be. And it's really cool to get to see that, and just to see like, again, like what generous, how much like kind of generosity of heart most young people have, right? That it kind of makes you sad how as grown-ups we like fight amongst each other so much, but really collectively all of the kids agree like, why wouldn't you welcome someone like Jude? And we should be nice to someone like Jude. And that's really affirming, right? To see that that's like sort of the base conclusion that the students draw.
I love that so much. Oh my gosh, I wish I could like be like a fly on the wall in your school visits and just like observe, and then like I'll cry in the corner and be happy. But jumping back to Other Words for Home, one thing that really stood out about the book was the writing style, especially the prose and almost like poetry like writing. How do you think the different formats of reading would change the reader's experience and interpretation? And also, what inspired you to explore the different forms of writing to share the story? We asked the format question mostly because Tiffany and I both had read it on audiobook, and I didn't realize that it was like written almost like poetry until I went back and I like looked at like the ebook, and I was like, whoa, this is like so interesting.
Yeah. So the book actually, when I was first drafting it, it wasn't written in verse. Because my first two novels were prose books, like, regular paragraphs. And it had never occurred to me really that I could write a book in verse. Like poetry had been a huge part of my reading life since I was in high school. But I'm also friends with lots of people that I would call capital P poets, like really real poets. And I never really like considered myself to be a poet, but I was really struggling to sort of crack open Jude's voice. And I knew that the book was going to depend on whether the reader really felt close to Jude. And I was also having this stumbling block of, really the book would be told in Arabic, right? But I was writing it in English. And I think that poetry and verse are actually really amazing places for translanguaging, where you can really play around with language because you can break like the rules of English grammar, right? You can put words in whatever order you want, and sort of that white space can kind of help with like helping you to pace out cadence and lyricality and things like that. And also, I think in the journey of someone finding their voice, like having a lot of that white space can convey to the reader her sort of halting thoughts, right? Of like how she's like moving through. And so I feel like once I figured out I wanted to put the book into verse, Jude's voice came alive for me on the page. Like I was hearing it in a way that I hadn't been hearing it before. And I think, again, that verse novels are really amazing at creating this like immediacy, this intimacy and rawness between the reader and the character. And so I think they're really well suited to a story like Other Words from Home. It's actually really a pretty quiet story, right? It's a book that's success kind of lives and dies on whether you feel connected to Jude. It's not an epic fantasy, right? An epic fantasy might not be so well suited to verse if you're going to have lots of different points of view and multiple plot lines. Like a novel in verse isn't going to hold that, right? But I think that format can be really well suited to something where the book is really about the character's voice, because it kind of makes voice the star. And what's been fun too, not to keep talking about school visits, but getting to talk with kids who do have multilingual abilities about how poetry can be a really fun place for them. Because there's an educator in Washington State who said something at a conference once about how every child that she teaches who is learning the language of English, like that their language of origin is different, speaks in poetry. Like this idea that we were talking about before of they're investigating, they're stretching English, right? And so kind of that I felt like verse was this space to sort of celebrate that too, and sort of also give kids this idea that like poetry can be lots of different things. When I was young, I thought I didn't like poetry because I thought it was only Shakespeare sonnets, and Shakespeare sonnets are great. And I know lots of people love them. I personally did not, and also don't have a brain that like works for structured poetry. And so I think showing that like actually poetry doesn't have to be this stuffy thing where you have to be an amazing writer to do it, but actually it's a place that like you can do anything and you can break all of the rules and you can draw alongside writing words is really like fun. And again, a place where like I think kids can celebrate not only multilingual abilities, but also like multicultural things of it's a really cool like form to be able to like have that kind of hybrid mix.
Now hearing you say that, it kind of like it's starting to like click for me, and that empathy and the way that we connect with Jude as a character also like really came through on audiobook, even though I wasn't looking at the verse. But for some reason, like the way that you were pulling it together, the way that you were like brain like moving the sentences or words around, it really came through. And I'm like, oh my God, it all makes sense. We talked a lot about your writing and your research, and we want to move a little bit into plot and characters. So particularly, we were really interested in Sarah because I think, as you mentioned in her author's note, a lot of her flaws and insecurities really reflect our own, especially during these coming of age years. So we were really curious, like as you look back, how did like your experiences or these experiences of the people you've talked to really shaped your character?
Yeah, so as I say in the author's note, I'm always a little bit embarrassed to sort of admit this, but was much more like Sarah when I was young than I was like Jude. I mean, unlike Sarah, I didn't really have like that sort of popular girl thing going for me. I didn't have like this friend crew, but more that idea, right, of I felt deeply insecure, right? I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. So when I was in predominantly white American spaces, I did not feel like I fit in, right? I didn't feel like I felt othered, and I felt like I wasn't enough of this thing. And then when I would go to predominantly Muslim or Arab spaces, I also felt like I didn't fit in, right? I felt like I was too American. I felt like I didn't speak Arabic very well. And so that feeling of loneliness, right? A feeling confused, of feeling like I didn't have any identity to anchor me, is something I really understand. And unlike Sarah, again, I think my reaction was just to hide, right? To be really, really quiet, which is different. But I did wonder, like, would I have been kind to my cousins if they had come to live with me in 8th grade? I don't know. And that's a horrible like thing to answer, right? But it's also an honest thing of I think I was trying so hard not to be noticed, right? That I didn't want to be noticed. I didn't want anyone to notice I was different. I was trying so, so hard. And I think that them coming over would have upended that hiding in a way. And so I could relate to her hurt. And I think too that when you're young, a lot of the things that you do that are unkind are because something inside you is hurting, right? And so it's kind of like that Arabic proverb that Jude references in the book, that you can't give what you don't have, right? And so if you don't have love for yourself, you can't give love to other people. And that's really sort of Sarah's journey in the book.
Yeah. Sarah was a super interesting character because of everything that you just mentioned, where like I see a part of myself in her, especially since she's like, and I'm born and raised in America, and she's also born and raised in America, and like we have this like similar upbringing. And then also like Sarah's interesting because she's not like your typical antagonist, because she's not like just like purely mean and evil. But she also has like her own insecurities about like not being able to read Arabic and like that stuff. And so I wanted to use that as like a transition to our next question about language, because language is a big metaphor in the book, and it also mentioned earlier how it shaped the prose, and it ties to identity and home. Jude creates a bond with her ESL class as they learn a new language, which is English, and adapt to their new life. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences with language as it relates to your identity? And do you speak any other languages aside from English?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So I don't. When I was younger, I feel like my Arabic was much stronger. I feel like I also have sort of that um thing that I think lots of people do whose parent speaks a language other than English, where they understand that language much better than they're able to speak it, just from hearing it all the time. And so when I was young, when I was really, really young, and we would go to Jordan, my Arabic would get much better over the summer. But quickly, really quickly, my cousin's English massively outpaced my Arabic, right? And so that would be my place to practice. And when we would go, I would just speak in English with them because it was easier, and their English was so much better because, of the ways that countries other than the United States value learning languages other than their own. And so in school, had a really rigorous English program starting basically from pre-K. And so nowadays, I really don't speak Arabic, and I kind of feel locked out of that part of my identity. I'll have moments I remember in college going to visit Jordan and going through immigration when I reached the airport. And of course, the person behind the desk starts speaking to me really quickly in Arabic, and I sort of answer in my really broken Arabic, explaining I don't really speak Arabic. Do you speak English? And them looking at me really baffled and saying, what kind of, at the time it was my maiden name, what Jasmine Nazik doesn't speak Arabic, and feeling that, right? Of feeling this idea of what does that mean? And how like untethered you can feel to those parts of yourself, right? Of again, that belonging piece of you also sometimes I feel like I'm disappointing people, right? Like even when I meet kids who are so excited, who maybe they have stronger Arabic language skills, and then I have to say, I really can't speak with you in the way that you want me to speak with you right now in Arabic. If we're going to have this type of conversation, it needs to be in English. And that's hard, but I love language. And I think that actually one of the things that I've noticed from getting to visit so many schools, which is exciting to me, is the era that I grew up in. I feel like a lot of us who had parents who spoke languages other than English, there was this weird in vogue thing about like fear that was almost like driven into immigrant parents about this idea that if you spoke too much of another language at home, your child wouldn't like speak English perfectly. And now I see more like kids celebrating multilingual abilities, and a lot of them seem to have way more like that's not in vogue of what's being told to parents, and there's much more like celebration of having multiple literacies, and that's really like a positive thing for me to see, because I know like in the era I grew up in, even my friends who spoke another language, it wasn't something they really talked about or wanted to talk about. And now I feel, at least the vibe that I've gotten, not that I'm saying there aren't still things that are hard about it for kids, but it seems like many more of them, like at least the school isn't saying like, don't speak this other language because you won't be able to speak English, which we all know now it is not like true at all. But I feel like there was an era where that was really strong messaging from a lot of schools.
Mhm. I think one of the really powerful points in the book for me was when I think it was Grace was talking to Jude, and she asked her like, what is the word you'll like miss the most in your like, home language? And I was like, oh my God, that hit hard for some reason.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked, because a lot of my friends, they also sit on this hyphen, right? They also have a hyphenated identity. And I have friends who feel like they see, so my language ability was never that strong. So what I've lost, I'm sad about it, but I also didn't like lose really a strong fluency, right? And I have friends who feel really heartbroken that it's like either they used to be able to read in this other language and now can't so much, or were much more fluent than they were and now don't have as much like practice with it, and they feel that slipping, right? And we would have conversations about that, about what does that feel like? You almost feel like it's a phantom limb or something, right? Where you used to be able to reach for it and now it's not there. And also just I love like languages, like I said before, and looking at them and also thinking about like why they are the way that they are and how language so much is shaped by culture. And so like looking at similarities and differences and words that come up all the time. I was recently like in France, and I'm not French, so I don't want to say anything that's offensive to French people. This is really wrong. But I love that it was explained to me when like basically their version of saying you're welcome is basically saying like it's nothing. And that to me felt very French, just from like the vibe of the culture that I got there, just like very like suave, like it's nothing, which is like very different than you're welcome, right? When you think about it, but they're conveying the same like sentiment, but just something, those small things that I find so interesting across sort of languages, of why do certain cultures say different, things.
I love that.
I feel like we could talk about language like forever and ever, but for the next question, the story ends with Jude stepping onto the stage for her performance, and it was really like beautiful and hopeful in the depiction of like Jude finally being seen and shining in her identity. Sandra and I were talking about it, and we were saying it kind of felt like a metaphor for Jude also finally being seen as her identity as like a young Muslim girl in the US. So what impact do you hope this story will have on readers, particularly those who may be struggling with their own identities or feeling marginalized in their communities?
Yeah, that's exactly like the ending image that I wanted, right? Of this idea of her stepping into her own power and her being seen fully in all of her complexity as Jude, right? Who's not just one thing. She's not Muslim American. She's not just a refugee. She's not just this girl in America, she's all of these things, right? And how she wants to be seen. And so the message like that I want is that you don't have to choose between these parts of yourself, right? And that you deserve to be seen as a complete and whole person. And also like you deserve, like, why not you? I remember, I think actually it's maybe Mindy Keeling who wrote the book that had that title, like why not me, of this idea that I think so many of us who didn't see ourselves in media when we were younger got this false sense like that we don't belong, that we shouldn't be the one who's on stage or shouldn't be the one who's doing this. And this idea of like you deserve to belong and you deserve to be seen and you deserve to be seen as your whole and complete self, and you don't have to choose between these parts of yourself. Like most of all, like when I was younger, I thought of sort of the hyphen in my identity as a divider. And I think that as I've gotten older, I've learned more that it's a connector, right? It's this way to honor all of these different parts of myself. And I feel like writing Other Words for Home was my way of saying that and hopefully sharing that with younger people to say like, if you have a hyphenated identity, there's a lot of beauty and power in that. And it doesn't need to feel like a fracturing. It's more this like beautiful thing that you have all of these things that are wonderful that you can share about yourself.
Oh my God, I feel so empowered right now.
No, me too. Me too. I'm like, wow, hyphen is like a connector, not a divider. I love that. Okay, we're gonna transition into some fun speed round questions as we begin to wrap things up. The first being, what is your most anticipated 2023 release?
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to go with what that is in my own household. So Tate Keller, I don't know if you all know her, but she wrote the beautiful middle grade novel When You Trap a Tiger, which won the Newbery Medal, and had her new middle grade novel, which is equally brilliant, like Jennifer Chan Is Not Alone. But she's written a series for like younger middle grade readers. The first one was called like Mihi Ever After, and it's about this young Korean girl named Mihi who loves princesses but doesn't quite feel like she fits into fairy tales, but like she wants to be a princess. And it's like such a fun adventure. She ends up in this fairy tale world. But anyways, this is all to say my kids loved the first one and the second one is coming out in May. So all of us are counting down together, and it was the most fun book to read aloud to them. And again, because it like, even though it's for super young readers, it has those questions of representation and like who gets to be a princess, and also what does it mean to be a princess. And it was fun to be able to like have those conversations with my own girls, while also they get to read this really fun like adventure book that has a much more diverse cast than any sort of like princess book I read when I was growing up. So I have to go with that book as my most anticipated one.
Definitely adding it to my list. I will be reading that for sure. Okay, so next one. What is a book that you would recommend to everyone?
Yeah, well, this book last year was the book that I was telling everyone to read, which I know kind of doesn't need any more plugging because I feel like it's a book like everyone's been talking about. But Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin was my favorite book that I read last year, and just I think was just one of those like epic books, right? It spans so much time, and the characters felt so real to me, and just it's this book about two childhood friends who end up designing video games. But I feel like it was such a beautiful metaphor for like creation, and what does it mean to create worlds, and what does it mean to play, and why do video games hold all this feel? I'm actually not really like a gamer, and I still loved and was so absorbed in the world of it. So I think if you're like the one person left who hasn't read the book yet, it feels like you should go ahead and read it.
It's literally sitting on my shelf, and I've been wanting to read it, but I have not been able to since I'm in school. But once I'm done with this semester, I will be reading tomorrow.
Oh, good. Well, I hope you'll love it too.
Thank you. I'm very excited. Okay, last speed round question. What is your favorite Asian food / what is your favorite food in general?
So my favorite Asian food is makluba, which is a traditional Palestinian dish, which translates to upside down. So it's
Ooh.
like you cooked in this big pot, and it's like rice and crispy cauliflower and a meat that's usually like lamb or chicken and roasted pine nuts. But you cook it, and then when it's done, you flip the pot, and so it's like upside down. And it's, to me, like, when I smell the spices that are in makluba, it just takes me back to all of like the big holidays when I was a kid, because that was like our family gathering meal to have. And then my favorite food is olives. I love olives, so any kind. I like black and green olives, but probably prefer green olives just a tiny bit. But olives are my very favorite food, and I'm like that annoying person that, like, if somebody sets out like a cheese board and they have like some olives, and like the guest you don't want, because I like eat all 8 of the olives. Just
We should share a charcuterie board because I don't like olives, and you can take all of them.
Yes, then we're perfect. So I'm always like, no, like that's olive ratio is not correct. Like I want an olive board, not a cheese board. So
That's so funny. Okay, so we want to wrap things up really quickly to be respectful of your time, but we're really curious to know, we know you just put out a book last year, but are you working on anything new right now? Is there anything we should have on our radar, or what fans can expect from you?
yeah, so I'm working on another middle grade book. And if I meet my deadlines, which are kind of touch and go, it should be out in fall 2024. And it's my first mystery, so I'm excited to get to do that genre, which is fun because, like, as a kid, I loved mysteries. And so it's right now it's still really loose, and I'm working on it. But it kind of, the premise is there, it kind of takes place in an art museum, and there's a painting that's gone missing, and then a ghost appears, and the ghost kind of looks like the person who's in the painting that disappeared. And so sort of figuring out the connection of why did this painting go missing, and who is this ghost. And so that's sort of the general framework.
Wow. There is something about middle grade mysteries that are just like so much more fun than adult mysteries. I can't put a finger on it, but it's
No.
just like there's just something different. I'm very excited.
I think it's also like the hijinks quality, because it's like it's almost like all middle grade mysteries are kind of like a metaphor for like doing things, like breaking rules, doing things that your parents don't want you to do, right? And like all of middle grade is kind of about like learning how to be a person who's separate from your family, right? Like, how are you your own person and having agency in the world? And so I feel like middle grade novels probably have that like extra hijinksy quality, because like in an adult novel, it's not a big deal to like go out at night to investigate something. But when you're like 11, that's a much like harder like proposition.
So true. So true.
No, that does make a lot of sense. Okay, final question. What do you hope for readers to get out of your stories, and do you have any last messages for your readers?
Yeah, I think what I want readers to get out of my stories is sort of what I talked about with Other Words for Home. Just this idea that like you matter and you deserve to be seen. I think all of my books in some way, whether I'm writing about a young girl from Syria or I'm writing about a Mars rover, are all about belonging, because that was kind of the central question in my childhood, and still is sort of the central question in my adult life of, you know, what does it mean to fit in, but sort of pushing back on that idea of fitting in, but more being like, I think once you learn to be comfortable with yourself, you fit in because you've decided that you do. And sort of that message of, you know, I was asked recently on a panel, like, to one word to describe yourself when you were 12. And I said hiding, for that reason I talked about earlier in this interview, of just like being scared to share myself. And I think that all my books hopefully have this message of trying to encourage readers who, if they're hiding, to stop and to learn that you deserve to be seen, and people in your life want to see you. And then just my message is always like that I think that the times that we live in kind of call for sort of radical kindness and radical empathy. And I think that the more that we can be kind and generous to one another, that's really like how we're gonna make the world better. And so hopefully like spreading that message, if even it's just like a tiny thing of going out of your way to make somebody feel more included, or again, being willing to share something maybe that you were too shy to share, because that can change and can influence somebody else to be brave. But that really, I think being kind is the most important kind of bravery. And so those are kind of the, I guess, central things that I like to share with readers.
Oh, that was so beautifully put. Jasmine, thank you so much again for just taking your time, like really just giving us this opportunity to speak with you. I know that for me, I could hear you talk for hours and hours because you're just so eloquent, and getting to know more about your writing and your approach to writing and all the characters that you bring to life has been super fun and rewarding. So huge thank you from us and the book club, and we can't wait to continue supporting more of your books.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for selecting Other Words for Home, and thank you for your amazing and thoughtful questions. This was so much fun. This was such a joy. So thank you.
Yay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Our March book of the month, is it March?
April.
Our April book of the month is Disorientation. I'm getting lost with like all the days and everything. But our April book of the month is Disorientation. You can chat with us on Discord and find out more information on our website and Instagram. But otherwise, we hope to see you next time. And if you haven't read Other Words for Home yet, which you probably should if you're watching this, but you should go out and read more of Jasmine's other books, and we can't wait. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.